The night was supposed to be beautiful, and in many ways, it was. The sun had set gently behind the hills of Ibadan, smearing the sky with soft gold and quiet purple. The drums had stopped. The laughter had faded into distant echoes. The dancing was over, and the guests had gone home, their wrappers and suits still scented with sweat and jollof. In the quiet corner of a candlelit honeymoon suite tucked in the village outskirts, everything was still. Everything, except for her heart. Morenike stood near the window, not moving. Her back was to the room. The hem of her wedding dress brushed the floor gently, the way dry leaves scrape the earth on a windless day. She wasn't crying. Her face was dry, calm even. But her hands, those small, careful hands, were clenched tightly around her elbows, folded across her chest like a shield. Her breathing was quiet, yet not steady. Each inhale carried weight. Each exhale seemed hesitant, like she feared her own breath would betray her. Her skin glowed in the soft light, but her spirit felt shadowed, somewhere deep behind her eyes. Behind her, Io sat on the edge of the bed they were meant to share tonight, the bed that symbolized the beginning of their life together. He had taken off his tuxedo jacket and laid it carefully over a nearby chair. His white shirt was slightly wrinkled, open at the collar, as though his chest needed more air. He hadn't spoken in 5 minutes. He didn't want to push her, but he didn't understand. Why wouldn't she face him? Why hadn't she said a word since the door closed behind them? They had been smiling just 2 hours ago. They had danced until their legs shook, had laughed until their cheeks hurt. The small village church, her mother's singing, the elders, blessings. It had all felt right, real. Now this silence wrapped the room like fog, heavy, cold, unseen, but thick. The walls were painted a gentle cream, but to Morenike, they might as well have been made of stone. She could feel the pressure building inside her chest, like something long buried was clawing its way up. But still, she couldn't speak. She couldn't move. Not yet. Not without knowing for sure if her truth would break him. Break them. She had never thought this moment would come. She had imagined it so many times before. What it would feel like to be married, to stand alone with someone who claimed to love her completely, to belong, to be safe. But she had also imagined this moment with fear, a fear that had grown roots inside her long ago, becoming part of her bones. It lived in her back, underneath the fabric, beneath the skin. And tonight, for the first time in her life, it had nowhere left to hide. When Io finally stood, his footsteps were soft against the rug, but she heard everyone like a drumbeat. He walked slowly toward her, each movement gentle, as if he were approaching a wounded animal. And maybe he was. She didn't turn around. She couldn't. The fear of his reaction, the look on his face, the judgment in his eyes, was more terrifying than any scar she carried. Her body stiffened as he came closer. She braced herself for questions, for confusion, for the weight of his disappointment. But he didn't speak. He stopped just behind her, close enough that she could feel his warmth, but far enough that she still had space. The kind of silence that hung between them now was different. It was waiting. A silence with breath in it. A silence that asked without words. Morenike closed her eyes. She remembered everything. She remembered the screech of metal against metal, the way the bus had flipped like a coin tossed into the air, the screams, the smell of burning rubber, the choking dust. She remembered waking up in a hospital, alone, with bandages wrapped around her back and the words, "You're lucky to be alive," whispered again and again by nurses who avoided her gaze. She had been 6 years old, too young to understand what survival really meant. Too young to know that the scar left behind would not only mark her body, but her soul. Her parents never spoke of the accident. They had lost too much in it. Her uncle, her cousin, her father's ability to walk without a cane. they wanted to forget. And so she learned to forget too, or at least to bury. To smile when she wanted to scream. To dress in ways that kept her hidden. To believe that one day someone might love her without needing to see all of her. But tonight was not a night for hiding. Her fingers trembled as they reached behind her neck and slowly undid the first button. Then the next. The lace loosened. She paused, her breath caught in her throat. Her heart pounded. Another button. And another. Her hands moved like ghosts, scared of their own touch. Finally, the dress slipped down her shoulders, exposing the deep, dark scar that sliced diagonally across her back like lightning frozen in flesh. It wasn't just a scar. It was a memory, a history, a question. Would he still want her now? She waited. The room felt colder. Time moved slowly. Then she heard a sound, fabric rustling behind her. She turned, finally, slowly, and what she saw made her knees nearly buckle. Ayo stood shirtless now, his own eyes full of something she couldn't name, shock, sadness, but not at her. At himself. Across the left side of his ribcage was a jagged scar, old, faded, but still visible in the candlelight. He was breathing heavier now, staring at her back, then his own side, then back at her again. Neither spoke. There were no words strong enough to hold what filled the room, but somehow, in the silence, something clicked. Something ancient, something spiritual. The same crash, the same year, the same road. They had survived the same storm. Alone, until now. Ayo sat back down on the edge of the bed, slowly, like a man lowering himself into the weight of something sacred. The candle flickered again, casting trembling shadows across their skin, across the old wounds that had somehow, impossibly, led them here. Morenike remained standing, her back still bare, her dress pulled silently around her waist like a fallen veil. The silence stretched on, no longer suffocating, but strange and still. It was no longer filled with fear. It was filled with a question, not the kind spoken aloud, but the kind felt deep beneath the ribs. What does this mean? Neither of them knew what to say, and so neither tried. Words felt too small for what had just unfolded. Two lives, long separated, long bruised by time and silence, had just been pulled into one crooked line. The matching scars, like keys unlocking a sealed room, opened something deeper than love. It was memory. It was grief. It was the pain of being 6 years old and seeing flames through the windows of a crumpled bus, feeling heat bite the skin, hearing voices fade into silence. Morenike slowly turned to face him. Her arms crossed over her chest, not from shame, but from the chill that now climbed her spine. Her eyes searched his, unsure if she was dreaming, if this was some cruel joke the universe had chosen to play on their wedding night. But in Ayo's face, she saw no mockery, only stillness, thought, recognition. "I don't remember anyone," she whispered, voice almost too low to hear. Not names, not faces, just screams and heat, and the color red. Ayo blinked slowly. "I remember a boy next to me," she added, voice cracking. "He was trying to wake his sister. She wouldn't wake up." Her gaze dropped. I think that's the last thing I saw before I blacked out." Ayo's chest rose, then sank, heavy. His hand gripped the edge of the bedspread tightly, knuckles pale. "That was me," he said, his voice dry, stunned by his own words. "My sister's name was Yemi. She didn't make it." And with that truth, something shifted again. It was no longer just their bodies that were bare. Their hearts were laid open too, raw with shared sorrow neither of them had prepared to face, let alone together, on a night that was supposed to be about joy. Morenike sat down beside him, careful not to touch him yet. They stared forward, both of them seeing things that weren't there: smoke, blood, tiny shoes, glass that shimmered like stars on the asphalt. The crash had never truly left them. It had grown up with them, like a shadow stitched to the soles of their feet. It followed them into laughter, into exams, into prayer, into adulthood. But they had never spoken about it. Not even once. Because no one ever asked. Because people move on. Because the world does not know what to do with silent survivors. Minutes passed like seasons. The fan above them creaked gently, circling the warm air like a slow tide. Outside, in the distance, a dog barked once, then went quiet again. The village was asleep, but inside this room, something ancient had awakened. "I think I knew you," Io said suddenly. His voice was quiet, unsure. "Or maybe I imagined you. But sometimes I used to have this dream of a little girl with beads in her hair, screaming. Her voice would wake me. I couldn't breathe. I always thought maybe it was Yemi, but the girl wasn't her." Morenike's mouth parted slightly, her hand going to her braided hair, where the beads still clinked softly when she moved. "I wore beads that day," she whispered. "Blue ones. My mother said they'd protect me on the trip." They looked at each other. Really looked. The kind of looking that peels back the years, that dares to remember what was once buried. It was terrifying, but also grounding. Like standing barefoot on the soil of one's past. There was no pretending anymore. No wedding night illusion of perfection. What they had now was real, messy, wounded, but alive. Io reached out. Slowly. Carefully. His hand hovered above hers for a moment, seeking permission. Morenike didn't move away. She let their fingers touch, then intertwine. It was a small thing, but in that moment, it felt like survival all over again. "I thought you'd leave," she said, eyes brimming. "I've always thought, if anyone ever saw it, they wouldn't stay." Ayo didn't answer with words. He looked at his own scar, then at hers. Then he reached for her dress and gently pulled it back over her shoulders, not to cover her out of discomfort, but to remind her she could rest now, that she was safe. "This scar," he finally said, voice low, eyes soft, "didn't make me leave the world back then. It won't make me leave you now." And somehow, those simple words felt larger than any poem, more honest than any vow spoken earlier that day beneath the flowers and ribbons. They were survivors, not just of an accident, but of the shame, the silence, the long, lonely years of pretending to be whole. They lay down, not as husband and wife ready to claim a perfect life, but as two humans who had finally been seen, not despite their pain, but through it. Outside, the wind stirred the trees, whispering like spirits through the leaves. And in the quiet of that room, with only the sound of their breathing and the slow spinning fan, something sacred began to heal. Morning didn't come gently. It broke through the windows in long golden slants, splashing across the wooden floor and catching the white folds of Morenike's dress still hanging on the back of the door. The scent of early dew and charcoal. Smoke crept through the half-open window from a nearby compound where someone had already begun boiling water. Birds chirped without care. Somewhere in the village, a radio crackled to life with a gospel song, slightly off tune. But inside the room, the world was quieter. Morenike sat on the floor near the edge of the bed, her knees drawn to her chest, her eyes distant. She hadn't slept. Not really. After their confessions, she and Ayo had lain together in silence, like two embers in the same ash, glowing quietly. But her mind hadn't rested. It had wandered through tunnels of memory she had never dared revisit. She reached for the small box she had packed days before the wedding, a box no one had seen her put in her bag. It was the only thing she kept locked, the only piece of her past she hadn't let Ao or even her mother touch. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside were yellowing hospital documents, a torn photograph of a bus half swallowed by trees, and a page from an old newspaper article titled "Tragedy on Ore Expressway. Dozens Feared Dead in School Bus Crash." She pulled out the article slowly, smoothing the creases as her eyes scanned the names listed at the bottom. The deceased. She had memorized them as a child, read them like scripture, trying to convince herself she didn't belong among them. Her name hadn't been on the list. She had survived. But there was one name she had never been able to forget. Ayodeji B. Adedayo, 6 years. Her fingers went cold. She read it again, and again. The same name, the same age. She stood up too fast, the blood rushing from her head. Her breath quickened. She turned toward Ao, who was still lying on the bed, eyes closed but not asleep. The light caught the curve of his shoulder, and there it was again, the scar. That same jagged scar across his rib? It was real. He was real. But if that name in the article was real too? "Your full name," she said suddenly, voice sharp, too loud for the softness of morning. Ao opened his eyes slowly, adjusting to her sudden change in tone. "What?" "Your full name," she repeated, stepping closer. "Say it." He sat up, confused, rubbing his neck. "Ayodeji Babatunde Adedayo. Why?" Morenike's hands dropped to her sides. Her knees weakened. She staggered slightly, grabbing the chair for balance. "That's not possible," she murmured. "That's not possible, Ayo." He stood now, alert. "Morenike, what's going on?" She reached for the newspaper clipping and held it out to him, her hands shaking. "Your name. It was on the list. The dead list. I've kept this since. I was a child, I don't know why, but I never forgot your name. You were one of them, the boy who didn't survive." Ayo took the paper, staring at it in stunned silence. He read the names once, then again, then looked at her. "But I did survive," he said slowly. "I was in a coma. They said I was gone. Even my uncle told me later that the doctors gave up. But then I woke up. 3 days later. It was a miracle, they said." Morenike's throat tightened. Her eyes welled again. "I remember you. Now I remember. You were next to me. You were quiet, holding your sister. You weren't moving." Ayo nodded slowly. "They tagged me," one of the nurses told me years later. "My body was wrapped. I was placed with the others, until someone saw my hand twitch." They both stood still now, locked in the weight of it. They had mourned each other as children, not knowing the other had lived. They had carried grief in secret, her believing the boy beside her had died. Him believing no one else remembered what happened. "But that's not the twist," Ayo said suddenly, his eyes widening with a thought. "Morenike. What was your last name before marriage?" She blinked. "Okusanya. Why?" He stepped closer. Slowly, his jaw tightening. "Your mother. Was she a teacher?" Morenike froze. "Yes," she said. "She taught at St. Jude's Primary. She was chaperoning the trip. She was the only adult who—" Her words stopped. Ao finished for her. Who survived? The room tilted. Morenike's knees gave way and she sat back on the bed. The memories began to flood faster now. The woman's voice calling out names after the crash, her hands bleeding as she pulled children from the wreckage. The way she held Morenike to her chest and whispered, "Don't look. Just breathe." She remembered a man carrying her mother, on his back across the field, and in that moment, Morenike had seen something. A small boy lying beside the bus, covered in soot, barely breathing. That boy was Ayo. Our parents knew, she said softly, the horror dawning. They must have known. My mother recognized your name. Maybe they thought it was better not to remind us. Ayo sat beside her. They let us forget. On purpose. Not to hurt, but to protect. But now, sitting side by side, grown and married, the truth had finally returned. Two children from the same wreckage, raised apart, lost in different silences. Somehow fate, or something larger, had brought them back together. Not in a hospital ward, not in a courtroom, but here, as husband and wife, survivors, of trauma, of time, of secrets. Their love was never just about romance. It was about return, about recognition, about the truth that sometimes pain remembers what people forget. The sun was high when they stepped outside. The village road was quiet, dust rising gently from the feet of an old woman balancing a basket of oranges on her head. In the distance, goats grazed near a broken fence, and two children chased a tire with sticks, laughter ringing through the still air. Life moved forward, as it always did, unaware of the storm that had just unraveled behind the doors of the small guest house. Morenike held Ayo's hand tightly. There was no makeup on her face now, no jewelry, no veil. Her hair was wrapped in a plain scarf. She didn't want to look like a bride, not today. Today she wanted to look like someone honest. Someone who had shed a skin and stepped back into the world, raw and whole. They walked without speaking for a while, past the rice farms, past the bakery where they used to buy meat pies as teenagers. The world felt new again, but also old, like they were retracing a circle that had been quietly waiting to close for 2 decades. It was Ayo who finally broke the silence. Do you think we were meant to forget? His voice was low, careful, like someone afraid of waking something sleeping beneath the earth. Morenike nodded slowly. Maybe. I think sometimes forgetting is how we survive. Until remembering becomes the only way forward. He looked at her, eyes heavy. I wonder how many other people carry scars like ours. Quiet ones, hidden, and never get to show them. She didn't answer. They stopped at the old chapel behind her mother's compound. It was no longer in use, just a crumbling structure of sunburnt bricks and a broken bell that hadn't rung in years. But Morenike had always come here when she needed to think. It was quiet, sacred in its decay. They stepped inside. The air was cool, filled with the scent of dust, wood, and faint candle wax from years ago. There was a rusted lantern on the altar. Ayo picked it up. Without speaking, he lit it. The soft flame flickered to life, casting long shadows on the cracked walls. Morenike reached into her bag and pulled out the old newspaper clipping again, the one with the names. She held it in her hands for a long moment, then looked up at Ayo. We should burn it, she said. He hesitated. You've kept it for so long. I kept it because I didn't understand it, she whispered, because it haunted me. But now I do. It's time. They stepped outside again, into the clearing behind the chapel where the grass had grown wild. Ayo placed the lantern on the ground and opened the glass door. Morenike slowly fed the paper into the flame. It caught instantly, curling at the edges, darkening. The names burned first. Ayodeji Babatunde Adedayo melting into black ash, as though being returned to the earth. Then the title disappeared, the inked tragedy finally releasing its grip on her soul. They watched until the last ember went out. Morenike didn't cry. Not this time. Her eyes remained steady. The pain hadn't vanished, but it had shifted. It no longer clung to her like a ghost. It now sat beside her like an old friend. Wounded, quiet, but known. I think we were chosen, Ayo said suddenly. Not for punishment, but for memory. She turned toward him. What do you mean? He looked down at his hands, then at hers. We were children who survived, alone. But now, we're adults who get to remember together. That matters. Morenike thought about that for a long time. Later that evening, they sat with her mother under the mango tree in the backyard. She served them efo riro and amala, eyes kind but watchful. It was Ayo who brought it up gently. You knew, didn't you? He asked. The older woman paused, then sighed. Yes. She stirred her soup slowly, as though the memory itself was something too hot to hold. I recognized him the first time you brought him home, she said softly. Not his face. That had changed. But the way he looked at you, like he'd already lost you once, that I remembered. Why didn't you tell us? Morenike asked. Her mother wiped her hands on her wrapper and looked into the sky, where birds were crossing in slow formation. Because some scars are better healed by time than by words. I was afraid that if you both remembered too, soon it would break something before it ever had a chance to grow. So I waited. Maybe that was wrong. No, Morenike said quietly. Maybe it was the only way. That night they returned to their room. The air was cool. The candles were lit again. But something was different. It wasn't just a room for love. It was a room for truth, for survival, for history. They undressed without fear, not because the scars had disappeared, but because they had finally been seen, and in that sacred seeing, something deeper than romance bloomed. The next morning, they packed their things and prepared to leave for the city. But before they did, Morenike took one last walk behind the chapel. She knelt beside the cold ashes and whispered a prayer, not for forgetting, but for gratitude. Gratitude that pain had not destroyed them, that it had led them, slow and brutal, to this place, this moment, this bond. The scar on her back would always remain, but now it no longer spoke of shame. It spoke of survival, of memory, of a boy with a matching wound, of a night when silence finally gave way to truth, and of a love that did not run from pain, but grew through it.